The jet was cleared to depart. The crew was ready. The flight plan had been filed. Fuel was loaded. Passengers were expected within the hour. Then everything stopped. Not because of mechanical failure. Not because of weather. Not because of scheduling conflicts. Because of government action. The aircraft was detained, quietly, procedurally, and without public announcement. No dramatic runway standoff. No armed officers. Just legal notices delivered through aviation compliance channels and clearance revoked through regulatory systems. From that moment forward, the jet could not legally leave the ground. This was not a criminal seizure. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. This was regulatory detention, an enforcement mechanism most people don't know exists. The aircraft was worth over $50 million. It was registered through a foreign aviation authority. Its operations were handled by legitimate service providers. On paper, everything appeared compliant. But sanctions enforcement doesn't stop at paperwork. And this jet had been under scrutiny for months, not because of where it flew but because of who reportedly controlled it and how that control was financed. This is how a luxury aircraft becomes a sanctions target. Please like and subscribe to this channel. For decades, sanctions enforcement focused on banks, companies, and financial accounts. Physical assets were secondary concerns, difficult to track, expensive to control, and often protected by layers of legal complexity. But as sanctions regimes expanded and became more coordinated, that calculation changed. Authorities realized that targeting money alone wasn't sufficient. Financial networks could be restructured. Accounts could be moved across jurisdictions. Legal entities could be dissolved and reformed under different names. Physical assets, however, leave trails. And among those assets, private jets became strategic priorities. Not because they're symbols of luxury but because they represent mobility, and mobility is power. Private jets allow sanctioned individuals to move across borders with minimal oversight. They operate outside commercial aviation schedules. They can be rerouted mid-flight. They can land at private airfields with limited regulatory scrutiny. For enforcement agencies, this made them both valuable targets and high-risk assets. Because unlike commercial aircraft, private jets operate through minimal public oversight, private ownership structures that obscure beneficial owners, complex registration systems spread across multiple jurisdictions, cross-border movement that can happen with little advance notice. This combination of mobility and opacity made private aviation a focus area as sanctions enforcement evolved. Authorities began asking different questions. Not just who owns this jet, but who pays for its operation? Who authorizes its flights? Who benefits from its availability? Those questions couldn't be answered through registration documents alone. They required financial tracing, operational analysis, and coordination with international partners. And as global cooperation increased, particularly after sanctions escalated, the tolerance for ambiguity disappeared. Assets once considered legally distant were now evaluated through a new lens: control and benefit. If an individual could use an asset, direct its operations, or fund its maintenance, then that asset could be treated as if it belonged to them for enforcement purposes. This shift transformed how private jets were viewed. They were no longer just luxury transportation. They were pressure points. They were evidence of networks. They were tools of enforcement. And this particular aircraft entered that enforcement pipeline during a broader review of high-value mobile assets reportedly connected to sanctioned networks. The jet itself was significant. It was a long-range business aircraft capable of transatlantic flight. It could carry up to 12 passengers in custom-configured luxury interiors. Its estimated value exceeded $50 million. But what drew investigative attention wasn't its value or capability. It was its operational pattern. Because private jets, despite their privacy, leave extensive documentation trails. Every international flight requires a flight plan. Every landing creates customs records. Every maintenance service generates invoices. Every insurance policy requires underwriting documentation. And every one of those transactions can be reviewed. On the surface, this aircraft appeared compliant. It was registered through a foreign aviation authority commonly used in international business aviation. Its maintenance and operations were handled by recognized service providers. Flight plans were filed through proper channels. Crew documentation was in order. To casual observers, nothing appeared irregular. To investigators conducting systematic reviews of high-value assets, it fit a recognizable pattern. Because aircraft at this level are rarely owned directly by the individuals who use them. Instead, they're held through corporate structures designed to provide privacy, limit liability, and optimize tax treatment. This is standard practice in business aviation. It's legal. It's common. But sanctions enforcement looks beyond legal structures. Authorities began examining who actually paid for the jet's operation, which entities covered maintenance contracts and insurance premiums, who authorized international flights and travel itineraries. According to public reporting, financial patterns connected to the jet raised concerns. Payments for the aircraft's operation reportedly traced back to entities and financial networks already under sanctions scrutiny. Operational control appeared to extend beyond the listed owner, with decisions about the jet's use reportedly made by individuals or advisors connected to sanctioned networks. The corporate ownership structure resembled arrangements seen in other cases already under investigation. Individually, none of these factors proved wrongdoing. Together, they triggered a deeper review. Because in modern sanctions enforcement, patterns matter more than individual transactions. A single payment might be coincidence. Repeated financial connections suggest linkage. One operational decision might be delegation. Consistent control patterns suggest beneficial ownership. And once that pattern is established, the asset becomes enforceable, even if the legal ownership structure appears clean. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Before sanctions expanded, this jet might not have attracted direct attention. Its registration was proper. Its operations were professionally managed. Its flights followed standard aviation procedures. But sanctions changed the rules. Under modern U.S. sanctions law, authorities don't need to prove criminal guilt to act against an asset. They must determine whether the asset benefits a sanctioned individual or network, is controlled by entities or persons subject to restrictions, uses financial channels or service providers that create U.S. jurisdiction. Once those connections are established, even indirectly, enforcement becomes possible. This is a fundamentally different standard than criminal prosecution. Criminal cases require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They require evidence of specific illegal acts. They require trials and due process protections. Sanctions enforcement operates under administrative law. It requires evidence of linkage and jurisdiction. It can proceed without arrests or indictments. It can restrict assets based on patterns of control rather than documented ownership. This distinction is what allows authorities to act quickly and preventively. As sanctions coordination increased between the U.S. and allied governments, the enforcement threshold changed. Assets once considered legally distant were now treated as extensions of sanctioned networks if they showed patterns of beneficial use or control. Ownership on paper became less important than operational reality. In this case, investigators reportedly determined that the jet functioned as if it served individuals or networks within sanctioned circles, regardless of how its registration documents read. The financial support for its operation, the decision-making authority over its use, the pattern of flights and destinations. All of these factors built a case for linkage. And under sanctions law, linkage is sufficient. The aircraft didn't need to be proven as belonging to a sanctioned individual in a legal ownership sense. It needed to be shown as controlled by or benefiting sanctioned interests. That standard was reportedly met. And once it was, the path to enforcement action became clear. The detention did not happen dramatically. There was no runway confrontation. No emergency orders radioed to pilots. No armed officers boarding the aircraft. According to reports, authorities acted through established aviation compliance channels. Formal legal notices were delivered to the aircraft's registered management company. Airport authorities were notified through regulatory coordination. Flight clearance for the aircraft was revoked through proper administrative processes. The jet was grounded quietly and procedurally. One moment it was operationally cleared. The next it could not legally depart. This is what detention means in aviation enforcement. The aircraft remains physically where it is, typically at an airport or private airfield. But it cannot be flown without clearance. It cannot be transferred to another jurisdiction. It cannot be operated until regulatory issues are resolved. Control, effectively, has been transferred to authorities. This is different from seizure in the traditional sense. Seizure typically involves physical custody, government agents taking possession of an asset. Detention involves regulatory restriction, government authority preventing an asset from being used or moved. The distinction matters legally, but the practical effect is similar. The jet cannot leave. Its owners cannot access it for operational use. Its value as a functioning aircraft is suspended. And while it sits grounded, costs continue. Hangar fees accumulate. Insurance premiums remain due. Maintenance schedules must be followed to preserve airworthiness certification. Security must be maintained. All of these expenses create financial pressure, without any corresponding utility from the asset. This is part of the enforcement strategy. Detention doesn't just stop the aircraft. It drains resources from the network that supports it. If beneficial owners want the jet released, they must engage with the enforcement process. That means legal challenges. That means disclosure. That means exposure. If they choose not to engage, the aircraft remains grounded, and its operational value deteriorates. Either outcome serves the enforcement objective. Because the goal isn't just to ground one jet. The goal is to disrupt the infrastructure that sustains sanctioned networks. And mobility is a critical part of that infrastructure. This detention was not about one aircraft. It represented a broader shift in how sanctions are enforced. For decades, sanctions focused on restricting financial access. Frozen bank accounts, blocked transactions, limited access to capital markets. But financial restrictions alone proved insufficient. Money could be restructured. Accounts could be moved. Legal entities could be reformed. Physical assets, especially mobile ones, became the next enforcement frontier. And private jets, like superyachts, are now viewed as strategic pressure points. They're not just transportation. They're symbols of elite mobility. They're evidence of networks. They're tools of enforcement. For authorities, grounding a jet sends multiple messages. To the beneficial owner, your mobility is restricted. Your assets are traceable. Your structure does not protect you. To the broader network, sanctions follow assets, not just names. Distance does not guarantee safety. Control matters more than ownership. To allied governments, enforcement coordination works. Regulatory detention is effective. The system is tightening. The implications extend beyond aviation. Because if private jets can be grounded through regulatory detention, other mobile assets face similar risk. Yachts can be immobilized. Luxury vehicles can be restricted. Real estate can be frozen. Any asset that requires ongoing financial support, service providers, or regulatory compliance becomes potentially enforceable. This is the new reality of modern sanctions. Ownership structures no longer guarantee protection. Layered corporate entities no longer ensure invisibility. Even mobility itself can be regulated. And luxury, once seen as insulation from consequences, has become evidence. Evidence of networks. Evidence of control. Evidence of connections that can be traced, documented, and restricted. This jet is one example of how that enforcement works. Not through dramatic raids or public spectacles, but through quiet regulatory action that makes movement impossible. In today's sanctions environment, even flight can be frozen. Please subscribe to this channel and stay tuned for more videos. Bye.